Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we are talking about X-Men Dark Phoenix, the probably final film in the current iteration of the X-Men franchise. Unless you count the New Mutants, which for the benefit of this sentence, I don't. And then once we've done that, we'll be discussing the side issue, to what degree do the circumstances of the film's release, such as, say, the large number of delays and reshoots on X-Men Dark Phoenix, affect our viewing of it. But before we get into both the film and the meta issues around the film, Alistair, what have you consumed in the last fortnight?
Well, I've been watching a new Amazon Prime TV show, the adaptation of Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's Good Omens.
Yes, you and most of my Twitter timeline.
Yes, yeah, it's certainly been popular. There's kind of enormous buses going around London with either David Tennant or Michael Sheen's face on the side of them. There's been a lot of advertising and buzz on social media. So it's good. It's okay to good. When it's David Tennant and Michael Sheen on the screen, it is really, really good and entertaining. Although, I don't know, I find it's very slow-paced. Or there are times when it's quite slow-paced. And it's not kind of slow-paced in a dull, nothing's happening sort of way. But I feel there's quite a lot of asides which just pad it out. I get the feeling this could have been... It's 6-hour-long episodes. I think it would have been better if it had been 3 episodes or maybe even 2.
That's quite a cut for, I mean, we've all sat through some quite padded 13-episode TV shows. But to say that a 6-episode one is a bit long is impressive.
Yeah, I don't know, for example, there's one episode that has, I think it's episode 3, has a 28-minute cold opening that doesn't really add anything other than it's quite nice to see David Tennant and Michael Sheen doing these kind of little comedy skits of them bumping into each other throughout history, which is sort of funny, but really doesn't contribute anything to the plot. So, yeah, I've kind of felt that, for pacing, it would have been better if you could have junked half that episode. So, yeah, I mean, the guys are good together, and... I don't know, I was talking to a friend on Twitter. I was saying there's loads of asides with other characters that I don't really care about, and it seems quite slow paced. And they said, well, all that stuff is from the book, and it is the book is full of lots of sort of tangents and a broad cast of characters. But this just led me to the realization the continued realization that super faithful adaptations of books aren't usually that good. What works on a page, especially Terry Pratchett's kind of quite witty, rambling detours he takes whilst telling a story kind of don't work so well translated to the TV screen. It just seems like, well, this is the bit we have to put in this episode to bring it up to 60 minutes because there isn't just enough David Tennant and Michael Sheen in this episode.
Yeah, I did read the book recently because I noticed I had it on my Kindle to read list and I fancied a bit of light fun. And it does have a lot of side stuff in it, but it isn't quite as... I don't know, the chemistry between the two angels isn't quite as central as you're making it sound. I haven't actually seen Good Omens yet. I'm still working through a previous recommendation, the second season of Star Trek Discovery. I hope to have reached this recommendation by the time you've recommended something else. But the book is very sprawling and does go to a lot of different characters. And to be honest, I don't know which bits you're finding boring, but there's a bit with some kids that I didn't find mega fascinating in the book.
Yeah, it's not unentertaining, but I don't know, maybe I just can't switch off my inner critic. That's sitting in the back saying, it should be shorter, should be tighter, should have another edit. I mean, it's kind of like the problem with later Harry Potters, is that no one could edit J.K. Rowling, so they just kind of became quite sprawling. And I get the feeling Neil Gaiman wrote the script for this adaptation. I kind of got the feeling people are really, Neil? 28-minute cold opening? And they're you can't edit me, I'm Neil Gaiman. And also, this has got Terry Pratchett's on it. You're not going to insult the late Terry Pratchett, beloved treasure of this nation.
We're not, are we?
Beloved treasure of this nation, by cutting some of his words from this TV show. Okay, I guess we'll go with the 28-minute cold opening. But yeah.
I did see him say on Twitter that the co-production with the BBC obliged him to make each episode between 52 and 58 minutes long. So I don't know if there was some genuine padding.
Yeah, if you really like the book, the consensus seems to be the people who really like the book really like this because it's mega faithful. If you like David Tennant or Michael Sheen, yeah, they're very good together and they're always excellent when they're on screen. It's entertaining. Like I say, I'd recommend it. I just feel that the BBC's limited budget, they used to do when I watch more BBC, they probably still do, kind of great bank holiday, 2-part adaptations of novels and things like that. You get one on the Sunday night and one on the Monday night or something like that. And I kind of felt that quite a lot of novels probably, especially these shorter novels, unless these sort of short novels, 2-hour adaptation or whatever seems to work better.
Okay, I look forward to finding out in about 3 weeks.
Yeah, I don't know. Listeners in MFV land, get in touch. Tell me if you've seen Good Omens, if you agree that it should be shorter, or if I'm just a Philistine and I can't enjoy the brilliance of Neil Gaiman in its unmediated form.
It is kind of a piece with most of the opinions I've seen on Twitter, outside of like hardcore fandom, is this is pretty good, but for David Tennant's Michael Sheen stuff is definitely the best bit.
Yeah. Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
I sat down and read all 12 issues of Mr. Miracle, a recent comic series by Tom King and Mitch Gerards. This is the latest story from the guy who also wrote Omega Men, which I think you've read, as well as Sheriff of Babylon and a 12-issue story about the Vision from Marvel. He seems to be quite fond of this format, of this sort of 12-part, somewhat novelistic, closed story with a beginning, middle and end in these sort of clear demarcated chapters. And this is about the classic DC Jack Kirby character Mr. Miracle, who is a character from the Fourth World section of the DC universe, the bit where Darkseid comes from, which has not really been done much in the movies. I believe there is a film coming in the next couple of years, and Tom King is actually down to co-write it. But yeah, Mr. Miracle is the trouble with this is it involves explaining large chunks of the Fourth World mythology. Mr. Miracle is a bit of a DC deep dive. Basically, the Fourth World has a sort of a good planet and a bad planet. They're New Genesis and Apocalypse. You might be able to guess which one is a good one and which one is a bad one.
Yeah, that's well telegraphed.
And as part of the fragile peace that existed for a while between them, they swapped male heirs, as people sometimes do in sort of fantasy settings. The male heir from New Genesis, who was basically kept on evil planet Apocalypse and had the shit tortured out of him for years and kept trying to escape, grew up to become this super escape artist, whose name was Scott Free. He has a real name, but he doesn't remember. So he is, in true comic style, an escape artist called Scott Free.
Right. Oh dear.
There have been a few takes on Mr. Miracle over the years, but this is the adult depressing one in which Mr. Miracle has a suicide attempt because he finally decided he can't escape his problems and then has to deal with it for 12 issues. Like in a sort of punishing premium telly darkness way. Tom King is... I think you've read Omega Men, haven't you?
I have, yes, and it was very good.
And you've got Sheriff of Babylon somewhere on the to-read pile.
It is on my bookshelf. Looking forward to reading it.
He does do that sort of very slow, carefully characterised style quite well. Like, he's the sort of writer who can pull off 12 issues of a guy grimly contemplating his own mortality and how it affects people around him, and the people around him are, gods and stuff. Like, at the same time as he and his wife are trying to deal with his failed suicide attempts, a war is breaking out on between New Genesis and Apocalypse yet again, and he's getting sort of dragged into it because the people who are ahead of him in the line of succession have died, and he's becoming increasingly important in this war just as he wants more and more to escape from it all. It's very nicely characterised. It is incredibly bleak, but it is very nicely written by Tom King, and the art by Mitch Gerards is very scratchy and, again, very good for the level of angst in this comic.
Is it a particularly accessible, title for people who haven't read loads of DC? Is it one you can just kind of pick up and read, or do you need like a grounding in kind of basic DC mythology?
I honestly am not sure to what extent you have to have a grounding in Fourth Worldology to fully understand this. There is a bit at the beginning, like if you buy the graphic novel version, the full 12-issue collection, which is what I read, albeit digitally, it does have like a 4-page intro, which basically, in a sort of fun, jaunty, fake TV documentary way, does explain the concept of the new gods for anyone who hasn't heard of them. It probably helps if you have some grounding in it. It probably helps if you're able to see these things as, the terrifying metaphors that they're meant to be rather than just silly.
Yeah.
But an effort is made to explain it to the newcomers. It's one of these things where I would be interested to hear what a person such as yourself, I suppose, who I think does like that sort of angsty, contemplating the nature of war stuff, but doesn't know anything about the Fourth World, would think of it. But on the other hand, it's 12 issues. It is a bit of a commitment if you're just going to find it a bit of a trudge.
Yeah, and I do like science fiction as well, which is, I guess it's got a sort of sci-fi setting. I mean, the Omega Men is set in sort of Green Lantern part of the DC universe, and having not read any Green Lantern comics, the only DC stuff I've read is actual comics as opposed to films I've seen is, aside from a bit of Batman I read at uni, was when we read some Justice League comics for this podcast. But Omega Men I found pretty accessible. I don't know if it's just sort of because it's a self-contained story with its own self-contained characters, but you can kind of dive in straight to it. You don't need real understanding about the backstory of Green Lantern or anything like that.
Well, yeah, Omega Men, it has a Green Lantern in it. I suppose as long as you're vaguely aware that Green Lantern is, like Magic Ring, Space Cop, you can probably pretty much handle it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think if you liked Omega Men, I think there's at least a reasonable chance you probably enjoy it. It's intense adult comics for adults in a very sort of takes itself seriously angsty way. Some people I know have read the first issue or two and then thought, can't really be asked to read 12 issues of this man contemplating his own suicide attempt. It's a bummer. You know, it's the world's grim enough already without me reading another 200-ish pages of Mr. Miracle deciding whether or not to kill himself. So,
wow, yeah,
yeah,
maybe not escapism as a lot of science fiction is.
Ironically, considering the premise.
Oh yeah.
Although, you know, Tom King is a good writer for capturing this sort of nice little nuanced moments. There are some moments of, you know, beautifully articulated joy in there as Mr. Miracle gets his shit together a bit on and off as the series goes on. Over the course of 12 issues, there is actually a journey he goes on from sort of the bottom up a bit and then inevitably down again. Anyway, I probably shouldn't spoil Mr. Miracle as it's really good. But yeah, if you're into the sort of comic I'm describing, it's a very good example of the genre. Probably one of the best ones in the last few years, but unavoidably a bit of a bummer.
First up this episode, we will be reviewing X-Men Dark Phoenix, or Dark Phoenix as I think it's been released in the United States. This is the 10th X-Men film, or the 12th if you include the Deadpool films, and the 4th in a series of possible sort of prequels to the original X-Men released in 2000. This film follows the life of young Jean Grey, played by Sophie Turner, who's been possessed by a mysterious space creature that is sort of all-powerful and godlike, and is sort of slowly consuming her, driving her mad, but also making her super powerful. We saw this film recently, so Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, I went into this film with expectations pretty low due to a combination of the bad reviews and the shitty trailers, which is going to colour your opinion a little.
Yeah.
I guess we'll get to that later. But honestly, this isn't a full-on shitfest, it's just a bit mediocre. To use the two obvious comparators, it is not as bad as its own direct predecessor, X-Men Apocalypse, or the previous time they did this story in X-Men The Last Stand. But at the same time, I'm not going to go crazy and say this is actually good either. The first hour or so is sort of competent, if slightly generic, X-Men angst action. You know, I was back with the characters again. I was happier to see them than I thought I'd be. They mostly were in character and had some good moments with each other. James McAvoy and Sophie Turner in particular are actually doing a pretty decent job with the material, I thought, in this one. It's a shame the other X-Men aren't played by more memorable actors, as I did find the rest of them mostly a bit blah. Although Jennifer Lawrence is actually nicely switched back on in this one, after a couple of films where there were many somewhat deserved jokes about how disengaged she seemed to be with the whole thing. But she's back in this one to an extent, possibly because of a thing that happens about halfway through, which I'm inevitably going to spoil at some point during this review. But I won't yet. But anyway, yeah, and then, unfortunately, they don't seem to really have any idea where to go with the plot. There's some aliens that appear and are quite generic baddies, and the second half of the film has some okay action bits, but mostly just kind of farts off a bit, and you just sort of end up shrugging at it, which is a shame. But there we go. For the record, I know we don't usually do star ratings on this podcast. It's a reasonable 2-star film, but I'm definitely not going to give it that 3rd star anytime soon.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. My sort of main takeaway is that it's kind of quite dull, as opposed to being offensively bad. I mean, it's not like a colossal stinker like the often maligned Batman vs Superman or, as you say, X-Men Apocalypse. It's not really as like painfully dull as some really dull films that we've covered, like Warcraft or Independence Day Resurgence. It's just kind of a bit sort of meh. Yeah, just not particularly good. Like, the plot doesn't particularly, although there's no gaping holes in it, it's not particularly engaging. And the characters also I didn't find particularly engaging. Like, as you say, Sophie Turner is I guess who's got quite a lot to do in this film, is good, and with her part. And James McAvoy seems to be the one person who has always kind of found some enthusiasm for playing Professor Xavier, whereas, as we said, like Jennifer Lawrence and Michael Fassbender have looked decidedly switched off in previous X-Men films. They're all right. I don't know, it just wasn't particularly interesting. It's oddly humorless as well. I mean, I don't know, I guess it's called Dark Phoenix, so maybe they're going for a darker tone. But I don't know, there wasn't really much deep introspection, which, I don't know, like the Christopher Nolan Batman films, which obviously had quite a lot of, I guess, interesting introspection as well as like a darker tone. But I don't know, as we discussed previously in this podcast, a winning format for 12A, moderate fantasy violence, summer superhero films does seem to be some action with a bit of humour, even if it's kind of self-aware, quippy, Joss Whedon-esque humour, or dumb comic pratfalls like Aquaman had. But this film, struck me as like sort of pretty humorless, but also not particularly engaging in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, there is a history of X-Men of taking it quite seriously and going it full in for the melodrama of it, which they do here, and I can kind of respect. Unfortunately, as I've said before in this podcast, I think the problem with taking it deadly seriously and going for that level of po-faced melodrama is it's a bit of a high-wire act, and if you take it all deadly seriously but it just isn't working, then you're left with a bit of a disconnect between how much the characters care and how much I care.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't fall screaming into that abyss like Batman v Superman did, in which the characters took it deadly seriously and I was either bored, rigid, or falling out of my seat laughing. But this is, yeah, it's just very po-faced and melodramatic in a very sort of, to be honest, in a way I see some of the CW DC shows, which does work some of the time in them because I'm with the characters and they've often set up these problems quite well, these life or death dilemmas where someone has to sacrifice themselves or something. But in this one, maybe because I haven't been that attached to this version of the characters, or maybe because it just sort of happens in quite a flat way in this film, I wasn't with it enough for the sheer level of dead serious melodrama to really work on me.
As you say, X-Men is something you can take quite seriously because of all the sort of comics, or at least all the very well-known comics. It has this strong message or metaphor behind it about, civil rights, stroke accepting people who are different to each other and not being frightened of each other. But one of the things I didn't like so much about this film is I felt that was very much pushed into the background. It was also kind of in the background for X-Men Apocalypse. And I guess throughout this kind of series of 4 X-Men films, the social commentary stuff has kind of been pushed more to the background. Not necessarily sure why. If it was because they were like, less lessons about society, more focus on character, then they didn't really do much in terms of character development in this film. So that kind of backfired. I mean, it is there. There is like the X-Men stuff about broader issues about tolerance in society and, non-mutants, suspicion of mutants is very much in the background, but I felt it's not brought into the plot in the way that I think X-Men Days of Future Past did very well of weaving the social message into the story, as well as like the action and the characters. The original Bryan Singer directed X-Men and X-Men United, I think, did that quite well. Also, like even X-Men Last Stand, I mean, it's a bad film, but it does do a good job of weaving in the plot line involving the cure for mutation into the main action plot. Yeah, it does engage with the main theme of X-Men, which I felt was kind of weirdly absent, or at least turned down for this film.
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem with the storyline they're adapting in both this and Last Stand, the Dark Phoenix storyline, I mean, they've kind of got a few problems with adapting that storyline, but just one of them is the fact that it doesn't really engage with the mutant hate stuff in that way. I mean, as you say, they tried to fudge it a bit by discussing the fact how one mutant losing control and doing a load of destruction and killing might affect human-mutant relations. Things are going quite well at the start of this film, but I think Professor X presciently says, we have to keep impressing the humans. We're one bad day away from them hating us again. And then, sure enough, Jean Grey smashes some stuff up and suddenly they've opened internment camps within about 10 minutes. So it's not the most subtle bit of social commentary, but it is there, or it's not really used heavily in the plot, as you say. But yeah, I guess that's probably why they built the Cure stuff into Last Stand, because, again, to give Last Stand the limited credit it deserves before it completely fucks the entire execution. They clearly realised at a plot level that, yeah, that social commentary stuff is what makes the X-Men films stand out, and the Dark Phoenix storyline by itself is just about a superhero losing control of her powers for whatever made-up reason, and it doesn't really play into that much.
Yeah. The other thing I felt was weirdly absent was, which is, for me, it is integral to X-Men, it does hinge very much on the relationship between Magneto and Professor X. The idea that they are, which relates to the social commentary, they're a dichotomy. They represent so many, social change or revolutionary movements throughout history when there's been kind of alternative versions. I mean, the most obvious one is Professor X is a bit like Martin Luther King and Magneto is a bit more like Malcolm X, which is ironic because Malcolm X has an X in his name. Or you could take it to other, Professor X is kind of like Martov and Magneto is more of a Lenin, or things like that. But the point is that the relationship between the two characters is kind of brings in the metaphor. There's the one who wants to gradually evolve to a better society and the one who wants to smash things up to achieve it now. The kind of the tension between them, and also the fact that two people have a long-standing friendship and also sort of rivalry, and also they don't like each other. But anyway, that is also not present in this film. Both characters are in it. I don't think they barely have a scene together or even exchange much dialogue, apart from the occasional Magneto yelling, "Charles, stay out of this!"
And the bit at the end, which seems to be one of the few genuine attempts made in this to provide a final ending to this whole franchise.
Yeah. I
do kind of agree that is one of the ways in which they don't really address the social issues. On the other hand, I'm kind of over storylines in which Magneto smashes some shit up and Xavier goes, "Don't do it, Eric, you're better than this," or something.
Yeah, I suppose they have really flogged that horse.
taken that well and drained it dry and then kept sucking until all the plants around it died. So, yeah, I can't really blame them for deciding to just let Magneto be a slightly more brutal hero in this film, rather than playing the will he go evil card again.
No, that's a good point, yeah.
I mean, the excuses to have Magneto fight the X-Men were getting a bit old by the end of Days of Future Past, to be honest. I think that was about the last time that seemed even vaguely good.
Yeah.
I guess the issue is they've clearly realised that Magneto doing that is getting a bit used up. But on the other hand, they haven't found much else to do with him either. He's just kind of there, because there's a memo somewhere in the Fox X-Men department saying Magneto is in all the films, with a note scribbled under it from some desperate writer going, but what does he actually do? And no one ever answering.
Yeah, we've got Michael Fassbender, and we've got one of the most iconic characters in comic book history. What are we going to do? I mean, I think, trying to think back to our review of X-Men Apocalypse, and I think we even said that, like, we'd probably prefer them to do some X-Men movies that didn't have Xavier and Magneto in it.
I think Magneto certainly could stand arrest. I will be interested to see to what extent they front the Magneto Xavier stuff in the inevitable Marvel owned relaunch of this property, because it is the one element that the Fox films have really just rinsed.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, mixed blessings, I guess, that there wasn't much of that in this film, yeah.
Yeah, the other character thing that didn't quite work probably was, unfortunately, the whole Jean Grey turns evil thing, which is, quite pivotal to the story.
Yeah.
In that, yeah, it's, despite being less of a car wreck than Last Stand, it does share one of its central problems. The main dilemma is the unlocking of Jean Grey's dark side, and they seem both confused about what this dark side is and slightly struggling to persuade me it exists. Again, Sophie Turner is doing a decent job of gamely playing the script in a way that seems sincere without her, just yelling, screaming and hamming it up. Her performance of a genuinely nice person just snapping isn't bad, but I don't know, it just seems to happen out of nowhere. Perhaps the problem is that they don't seem to have any idea what to do with Jean Grey apart from this story, so literally the only thing Jean Grey does is turn up, seem nice, and then lose her mind and kill some people.
Yeah.
And possibly the Phoenix story had more impact in the comics because Jean Grey had done other things in the preceding, 200 issues before she got infected by the Phoenix and killed some people?
I don't know. I guess there's two ways you could write this, which I was thinking about when I left, which is you could either have Jean Grey is basically sweet, nice, and innocent, and she's possessed by a space demon that makes her do terrible things. Or you could do Jean Grey is underneath it a bad or flawed person, shall we say, and she's given an enormous amount of power, which brings out the worst in her. So it depends on how morally neutral the Phoenix, or sort of the space energy source that she absorbs, is. And also, I can kind of see how they didn't want to write a Jean Grey without agency, and they wanted to give her some complexity as a character, like she's struggling with trauma from her parents' death. I could see how that's a more interesting take on it, rather than the more straightforward Jean Grey is basically all nice and all good, but she is possessed by an evil thing that came from outer space. But I don't know, like I say, it probably needs some better character development. And also, I guess, she does kind of snap quite quickly from, I'm regular Jean Grey to, now I'm throwing police cars at people.
Yeah, I mean obviously, this is not actually this version of the character's first appearance. She was in Apocalypse, where all that really happened was she had yet another, ooh, it's the Phoenix, bit of foreshadowing. Which, does that, I know X-Men Apocalypse isn't really going to stand up to analysis, but does it make any sense that the Phoenix was in her mind in Apocalypse before she'd met the space thing? Probably not.
I don't know. I mean, in this version, they're kind of claiming that Jean Grey is the Phoenix. The space thing is just a big psychic battery that she swallowed, giving her enormous power. It is kind of morally neutral, I assume, yeah, and it's all Jean Grey's dark side that's coming out and making her do terrible things. It doesn't talk to her. It's not like Venom, which we watched recently when Tom Hardy monologues with a weird space demon that's possessed him. I mean, yeah, it is basically, she's just had her power turned up to 11.
Yeah, because I guess they seem to have identified that having her be innately dark would be more interesting, but it's also just not really there.
Yeah.
And also, while we're on the space thing, I suppose, I can respect them actually using the space thing from the comics this time, but it's not very interesting, is it?
No.
They've hired Jessica Chastain, which was a strong start to represent the actual villains, but they really haven't written her, for lack of a better term, apart.
No. Quite a lot of reviews on Twitter I saw of the film kind of said, why is Jessica Chastain in it? This is not a particularly good part, and we assumed that she would not do parts that were quite flimsy and not very good.
I mean, maybe her part had more backbone to it in the the original script before it was, according to Twitter rumour, reshot quite extensively at least once, if not twice. Possibly because it was too similar to Captain Marvel. We may never know. But yeah, the net result is that the villains, aside from Jean Grey, who ultimately isn't really evil, are just kind of goons. There's not really anything to them, and that's one of the many reasons why the back half feels a bit, like the plot's basically ended once Jean Grey decides she doesn't want to be evil, and then all that happens is they fight these generic goons for another half hour.
Yeah. Well, there's a sort of degree of moral ambiguity of, did Professor X do the right thing in basically messing with her mind to heal the trauma from the death of her parents? And this obviously explodes out when the Phoenix comes in, and then I don't know, we're about to go full tilt spoilers at this point, I think. If you're here for a flavour, you've probably got the flavour at this point. All right then. What happens is Jean Grey looks into Xavier's mind, basically realises that he was a good guy, which is not exactly the twist of the century, that Professor X is a good guy underneath it all, and then decides she will also be a good person, and then cue 20 minutes of spectacle, which was at least spectacular. And worth watching. Like, one of my notes is actually, again, for a moderate fantasy violence 12A action movie, this one weirdly did seem to lack spectacle. I kind of felt that, like, it's the cinema, it's the big screen, use it. I don't know, a lot of this film felt very much like a TV show, in sort of both in terms of emotional scope and in kind of the scope of production. But yeah, the plot kind of fizzles out, and then there is some genuine spectacular action on the end, which was moderately entertaining.
What, the train sequence?
Yeah, the train sequence in the end was not as dull as what had preceded it, although the plot at that point had completely gone. So, yeah, you could either have a semi-plot that is not that engaging with some fairly uninspired action, or some bit more inspired action without plot. Seems to be the game of two halves in this film.
As you say, the plots are just trailed off, but on the other hand, at least there was a good fight, and Magneto flattened the whole train carriage at one point, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
The one thing they don't seem to have lost their knack for is fun things to do with Magneto's powers. He seems to be a superhero who people enjoy writing, doing ridiculous shit with metal.
Yeah, the whole bit when he's got like about 30 guns just floating in midair or firing at the principal villain, the Jessica Chastain character. Yeah, well, had that moment of like, okay, that is pretty impressive. Yeah, it's the big screen, you're using it. You know, so yeah. Or like, when the train comes off and kind of flies through the air and disintegrates and everything's spinning around them. Yeah, it's entertaining, which is, I didn't expect deep revelations into like the nature of suffering. If I wanted to see that, I'd gone to see Shame starring Michael Fassbender, or Hunger starring Michael Fassbender. Michael Fassbender's got form in this department. This film is supposed to be entertaining.
If I want to see a man suffering, I'd have watched one of Michael Fassbender's earlier, less inspired X-Men performances.
Yes, that is also watching Michael Fassbender suffer on screen, but in a slightly different way.
That I suspect he may not have enjoyed this that much either, but he did hide it better.
He did hide it better, yeah. I will buy a beer for the journalist who, during the press junket for this film, asked Michael Fassbender, so, which made you suffer more? Starving yourself in hunger to the point when you generally look like you're on the verge of death, and apparently his body has never recovered from that performance. Did that cause you more pain, or was being in X-Men Apocalypse cause you more pain? Michael Fassbender will probably be entitled to lamp that person.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough Fassbender aside. The ending did bring spectacular action, but did not bring plot.
Yeah, the film prior to that did suffer from a bit of a lack of scale. Like, it's all very well talking about this massive cosmic entity, but they seem to struggle to get away from just people standing in rooms quite a lot. And on the other side of the scale, a lot of superhero films tend to break down a bit too much to superheroes running at each other across a generic landscape.
Yeah.
Which this film did avoid, I suppose, except at the very, very end.
Yeah.
Where some aliens ran at Phoenix over a generic landscape and she just disintegrated them. Which was, again, quite cool for the few seconds they ran it for. They thankfully didn't make that bit drag on too much.
No.
It didn't really have much visual ambition, this film. There was an okay space rescue bit at the start, but even that felt a bit perfunctory.
Yeah, the problem is, it just felt like so much setup. I guess they went through it quite quickly, but it was kind of, I was feeling like we're just waiting for, the big cosmic energy thing to show up.
Well, I guess we've turned up for the Phoenix film. We've seen the trailers. We know that we're here for Sophie Turner to get infected by a big evil thing. We know what the X-Men are at this point. Why hang around?
Yeah, exactly, which at least that bit was all right. It kind of progressed through that. Yeah, but it's kind of a shame. I felt in the middle bit of the film, some of the big emotional bits didn't really land. And like I say, we are in full tilt spoiler mode. But in the middle bit of the film with the death of Mystique, played by Jennifer Lawrence, I don't know, it felt oddly emotionally hollow to me. it just didn't really work, and it's supposed to be the big emotional bit in the middle of the film.
Yeah, there was a few attempts to remind us that Mystique is close to Xavier and Mystique is close to Beast. Nicholas Hoult, actually. All right in this film. But yeah, then she just died slightly suddenly and in a slightly weird way. I think considering everyone spent the last few films again going, wow, Jennifer Lawrence sure looks like she wants out. Most people's reaction was surely just, oh, they've let her go. Good.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, it didn't really land that well, which is a shame, because some of the X-Men angst stuff at the mansion when they were all talking to each other and to Xavier, I actually didn't mind. Maybe that's just because it felt very authentically X-Men-y. Again, once the actual plot got going, things seems to get less and less good.
Yeah. It's kind of a bit of a shame because this is the last X-Men film in this series. I mean, this is, an impressive series of 12 films. It began in 2000, so nearly 20 years, spanning nearly 20 years, with the original X-Men starring, Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, and Ian McKellen, and Halle Berry as well. And that very much kicked off the whole superhero revolution that has swept the world in the last 20 years. But it all began with X-Men. Pretty much. It's like that's kind of the first really totemic success of this cinematic movement. And I guess that ball that was set in motion nearly 20 years ago has finally stopped rolling, but with a slightly disappointing film. I guess the X-Men ended not with a bang, but with a whimper.
Yeah, I know. I did wonder if during one of the many rounds of reshoots they might have tacked something on to give it a sort of a vague, waving send-off to the entire franchise. And I guess maybe that last scene with Xavier and Magneto was meant to do that. But, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I was expecting. A scene where McAvoy morphs into Patrick Stewart, maybe. Like a full regeneration scene.
Yeah. I don't know. Logan seemed like a much better end to the whole thing in that Patrick Stewart and Hugh Jackman, we're now about to do full tilt spoilers for Logan. They both die and, the X-Men are sort of laid to rest by a little X-shaped grave. That seemed like a good point to leave it at.
Yeah.
And they came back and did 2 films after that.
I'm sure with the benefit of extreme foresight, surely the X-Men producers might have just let it die at the end of Logan, rather than doing what they later instead did.
Yeah.
Logan was after Apocalypse, wasn't it?
I can't remember.
Jackman was in Apocalypse, and Logan was his actual last performance.
Oh, yes, no, you are right. So, yeah.
So they could have let it die with Logan. It would have been an ending, but instead, a bit of a sad trail off for the actual X-Men franchise, but at least it would have ended. But instead, we have this. Oh, well.
Yeah.
To be honest, I started off by saying it's not awful, just mediocre, and I like it less the more we talk about it.
It's flawed. I think we've covered that. I mean, the thing is, it's not terrible. It's got flaws, which we've just discussed at length. But the good stuff is just, it's not really fun to say, there was a quite average fight scene in the street in the middle. There was some quite average arguing between characters. There was some good action on the end, but the plot really had gone at that point. I mean, it's not terrible.
Have fun, everyone.
Next, we'll be discussing to what degree does the circumstances of a film's release affect our viewing of it. This film has been released around a lot of bad reviews, Twitter-based rumour of reshoots, a lot of speculation about the future of X-Men films now that Marvel has rejoined the Disney and Fox parts, of the Marvel comic book franchise into one entity. Although nothing's been confirmed at this point, this film has been advertised with phrases like, their last battle will be their greatest. Make of that what you will. However, we try to review films under their own merits and look at them in isolation. But is that possible when there's a constant stream of speculation about the future of X-Men on social media? Nick, any thoughts?
I think it probably isn't possible, at least not if you want to be in any way plugged into the culture in the way that a lot of people now are. I mean, I sometimes forget that not everyone cares to the extent that I, or even you, no offense, do. I don't think you spend as long on comics Twitter or on geek content sites as I sometimes do, although I don't read them as much as I used to because the standard of journalism has really disintegrated. But yeah, I think if you want to be involved in the culture, unfortunately the culture is going to reach out and shape your opinion of it, and Dark Phoenix has unfortunately been quite fucked by that due to all the reshoots. I mean, the fact that they literally put out a trailer for this film with a release date on it and then delayed it another 9 months does make this a particularly egregious example of what the hell are you doing.
Yeah, they were trailers for this before Aquaman, which was ages ago.
Yeah, there were trailers for this when it was originally meant to come out, I think last summer, or possibly towards the end of last year, and then it got. Yeah, as I say, they released trailers with that date on it, and then it was pulled again. And obviously the other film, New Mutants, is still in limbo. So obviously there are things going on. How many of them relate to this film and the content and quality of this film and how many relate to the general Marvel Fox buyout drama, we may never know. But it's hard not to go in thinking this seems like a bit of a shonky enterprise, even if it is unfair to the actual content, which it kind of isn't, because the film itself is a bit of a shonky enterprise, but still.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of my opinion on the thing as well, which is that the circumstances will inevitably shape your appreciation of a film. And in this case, especially, partly because all of the speculation on Twitter about, well, the film being bad, the reasons for it being bad, and also the future of X-Men and the non-future of this sort of incarnation of the X-Men. All of that on social media has drowned out all of the promotion for the film. It seems like, other than a few paid ads on Facebook, it seems to be there's not really much of the promotion for this film, or much of the actual discussion of the film is having any kind of cut through, at least not in my corner of social media. What is cutting through is speculation about what form the X-Men will take when they're inevitably introduced to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
I mean, I did see a bus poster for Dark Phoenix that had a cool lenticular thing going on where Sophie Turner changed from Jean Grey to Phoenix and back. That was quite good. Possibly the best Dark Phoenix content I saw on the day I saw Dark Phoenix.
Wow.
There we go. Promotion exists.
That is damning with faint praise, if I ever heard it.
But yeah, it has been a particularly bad example of that. I mean, sometimes films can surprise you. This is a bit of a negative example of that, but I do remember feeling a genuine drop in my little heart when the review embargo came down for X-Men Apocalypse, and the reviews started flooding in and were all uniformly pretty much, yeah, this is not good. In my mind, at least, the meta-narrative for that had led me to think this might be okay. You know, it's another film by Bryan Singer, who I know is not someone who is in good public favour anymore. I was still enjoying his movies, at least at the time. Or at least I'd enjoyed his previous X-Men movie. I thought the Fassbender-McAvoy versions, the whole first-class generation, were still quite promising. Yes, the Apocalypse looks a bit silly, but still. And then the reviews came down, it's like, no, this is bad. Yeah, for some reason the circumstances completely failed to penetrate until that moment. Yeah,
First Class was good. We were like, oh, when I saw that, I was like, oh, we're back to good X-Men movies. That's nice. And then Days of Future Past was, much better. And I was like, oh, they're on an upward trajectory. Based on this logic and the 2 data points I have, the next one is going to be through the roof. And I guess what we've learned is that past performance does not indicate future outcomes.
Another superhero trilogy turned shit on the third one. Anyway, yeah, I mean, obviously I try not to get too swept away in the box ticking of it, you know. Like yes, it's hard not to be affected by the wider circumstances, but I don't want to get too obsessed by does this film matter. Like, I'd like to think that if this film had been better, I would not have cared, but it basically doesn't matter in continuity, if that's the term at all. You know, it's sort of the last hanging appendix of a dead franchise. It's never going to be continued. It's just being released because it's already been made.
Yeah.
There are people I've seen posting going, oh, what's the point? Why even bother releasing or watching it? It's like, well, if it had been good, then it'd been good. But I'd like to think I don't go as far as disregarding films because of that. But in its own way, that does go towards the lingering sense of pointlessness.
Yeah, like as critics and even as viewer, I think it is important to, as much as possible, view a piece of art or a film in isolation. You know, that you do need to assess it on its own merits, which, hence the top half of this episode. But yeah, it is important to try and separate something from the context, but also at the same time, it's important to put art in context. It's because it's by viewing art in the context that we understand it. That's why we have museums, for example, or also film festivals or film series and things like that, and DVD box sets. They're not just ways to package stuff to sell you kind of bundled content, although they are those things, but also they're part of the nature of art. That's why people have been collecting items and arranging them into groups, probably for as long as we've been people. That the context matters. Part of the experience of seeing a film and responding to it is locating it in its context, which is in these days involves the social media buzz, the kind of fan discussion and fan content around the film. So it's kind of part of the meta experience of watching the film.
Exactly. I mean, no one wants to go into the full Gamergate or whatever attitude of strict meritocracy. The context doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, I don't know, were the special effects good? Was the gameplay good? Whatever that means. So, yes, it's good to actually sit down and go, okay, is this well made? But you can't pretend that the world around it doesn't exist. That's why we say that's at the top of the podcast. And definitely not just because I came up with it one day and thought it sounded cool.
But yeah, exactly. Well, it is kind of what we do, is that we do pop culture, which is the first bit of the review, and now we're doing the world around it in a very meta way.
Just ignore the 30 episodes between us coming up with the tagline and coming up with this format.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. No one needs to know.
It's okay. I've seen the download figures. No one does.
Yeah, fair enough. And also, like, it's fun as well as being part of the artistic experience. It is fun to speculate about the future of these things, especially when the X-Men, this franchise, is probably going to end. As we, again, discussed in the review, it maybe should have ended, like, 1 or 2 films earlier. But yeah, and, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is currently going through its, you know, Imperial phase. It's going from strength to strength.
If anything, it's in its second Imperial phase, which is just baffling.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a brief period where its ironclad grip on the culture seemed to be weakening, and now it seems to have clamped down tighter.
Yeah, and, you know, inevitably it's fun to speculate, like, how will X-Men be folded into the universe that contains Spider-Man and Iron Man? Well, not Iron Man anymore. Full tilt spoilers for
Avengers Endgame, yeah.
Avengers Endgame, yeah.
It's okay, it's been out for like 40 days.
Yeah.
It's long enough for Jesus to emerge from the desert and have seen it, so I'm sure you have.
I'm just going to pause for a minute to appreciate that.
There we go. That's the best joke in the podcast. But I mean, it is. I mean, there is, I suppose, to swing gloriously back to the other end of the point. It is possible to be slightly swept up in the, I don't know, the groupthink of it all. I suppose is the operative term, even though that is again a bit of a Gamergate talking point that annoys me. Sit down and go, holy shit, I'm about to see a good film before you see a widely liked film. And, you know, the sad life of the critic, both trying to resist the temptation to slag off something popular just because you can, and also try and resist the temptation to give something a good review just because everyone else likes it.
Yeah. Although I do find the most interesting and surprising films are the ones when you don't think they're going to be good and they turn out to be good. Conversely, the most disappointing films are the ones when you think they're going to be good and they turn out to be bad. But then again, there's also an element, if you lower your expectations, the film can exceed them. It's, you know, it's easier to exceed lower expectations.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this film probably benefited very slightly from the fact that I went into it thinking this is going to be a long, dark trudge through a sewer pipe. And instead it was merely just quite dull.
Yeah. Oh, for me, I think very much is Ant-Man is the one that is the opposite for that. The one I really quite like Ant-Man, because when I saw the concept and like the trailer and stuff, I kind of thought, it's like he talks to ants and he gets tiny. Is this a Marvel film too far? And also it had problems with it was going to be directed by Edgar Wright, then wasn't. And then so my expectations were quite low going into it, and then I was like, it obviously really exceeded my expectations, and I thought it was very, very good.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, Ant-Man's a good example of a film that had slightly similar, although not as extensive, production fuckery and managed to turn it around.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he said, like, if Disney can do anything, they can put out a competent summer blockbuster.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing their competent X-Men film.
Yeah.
I was actually trying to think of, I mean, the most recent example I could think of a film that I was properly pleasantly surprised by. I mean, it wasn't a major pleasant surprise, but I liked Aquaman a lot more than I expected to.
Yeah, that's another good example as well. But then also that's like Aquaman is definitely grading on a curve.
I've consumed a reasonable number of other reviews of Aquaman thanks to the fact that I listen to a lot of these sort of podcasts. And I think I liked it more than the general consensus, to be honest. Like, I would have given that a solid 3-star, and a lot of the reviews I listened to, I got the feeling were closer to the sort of 2-star review I just gave Dark Phoenix.
Yeah, whereas I really liked Aquaman, but yeah, that's the thing. After DC shat the bed with Batman v Superman, and we, against our best judgment, got back into the bed for Justice League, and they shat it again, which really is our fault more than anyone else.
Justice League was very much the Dark Phoenix to Batman v Superman's X-Men Apocalypse, if it was merely boring rather than aggressively shit, but still.
Yeah, but then the fact that they managed to persuade us to get into the bed for yet a third time, and they didn't shit the bed, meant that they kind of got lauded with applause.
Well, they seem to be on a very mild upswing, I guess. I mean, I didn't see Shazam, but I'm told again it was okay.
Yeah, and the poster for Wonder Woman 1984 looks very cool.
Yeah, that's obviously a franchise with some actual credibility at this point. Having made one good film and put out an interesting poster, it's actually going to be interesting to see what the hell they do with it.
Yeah, but to drag this back to the question, the thing is, like, the context of the DC releases means that you can't separate from the fact that Justice League was bad, Batman versus Superman was really, really bad. You can't separate that context from when you go into a film like Aquaman, because you can't view it in isolation. The circumstances around its release, i.e. all the previous films in this franchise being terrible, apart from Wonder Woman, which was good. You can't separate it from that context. So because you can't separate from that context, it inevitably shapes your appreciation of the film, which lead to me thinking that film was good, and I liked it. What this means is that if they'd started the DC franchise with Aquaman, and I guess there'd been less context for seeing it and less baggage around it, I would have probably been right, well, that's a bit of a film to start a franchise with. You think they'd have gone with something better. So that my entire appreciation of Aquaman is shaped by the circumstances in which I saw it. and all the films I've seen in the previous years leading up to it. And the same with Dark Phoenix. It's shaped by the fact that, like, I really enjoyed seeing X-Men film in 2000 and thought this is a really cool franchise. I want to see more of it. And, how much we've been there for the highs and the lows, the highs of Logan, Last Stand, Days of Future Past, and the lows, which we've outlined at length.
Yeah, I mean, we all live for the feeling of, guys, I sat down to see a film, we all wrote off and it was amazing. Like, I'd always like to be able to defend Dark Phoenix, but I can't.
No.
Although I do think the current season of Supergirl is underrated. But anyway.
I suppose that's another thing where it's just like, when you're doing shared universes, TV or film, that, like, it's very hard to view a film outside the context of that. Like, for example, Marvel inevitably will put out a duff film. It's going to happen. And obviously, like, Thor Dark World wasn't particularly good. When they do put out a bad film, I can imagine it's going to get absolutely savage reviews, because it's going to be, finally they've put a wrong step, and this shows that, like, they don't have the Midas touch. It's going to be kind of like the Magical Mystery Tour. Again, possibly unfairly, I'm really going off topic here, but possibly unfairly maligned Beatles album and TV experience. It's because the Magical Mystery Tour was the point when the Beatles were like, aha, you are mortal. Everything you touch doesn't turn to gold. And it all kind of spiraled out of control from there. Whereas it's the same thing, like a slightly flat Marvel film, because of the context, we can't separate it from the context of they just make great film after great film after great film, more or less, with a few hiccups along the way. When they do something bad, the context will mean it gets a savage kicking.
I mean, I get the feeling people quite enjoyed kicking the shit out of the first season of Iron Fist for roughly that reason. I mean, obviously it's not quite as good because it's a TV show rather than a film, and the TV division seem a bit less vigorously, reliably competent than the film division. But yeah, I do get the feeling that people did enjoy Marvel having finally released something, but pretty much everyone agreed really, really sucked.
It's just the way we live now is that, like, we're just surrounded by context. It's almost impossible to isolate yourself from it.
To the extent that we have these weird, you're a person I know and I resent and hate your success relationship with major film studios and just keep waiting for them to fail.
Yeah.
Healthy? No.
Probably not. Fun? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's the sense of Schadenfreude when, like, a rival football team of yours does terribly or something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no Schadenfreude in the failure of Dark Phoenix because this franchise has not been anywhere near as reliable.
Yeah, I suppose we are part of the context now as well. I mean, like, we are very much flaming the the flames of the circumstances around the release of Dark Phoenix.
It's true. I almost feel bad. Okay, and that was this fortnight's Moderate Fantasy Violence. We hope we have affected your opinion of X-Men Dark Phoenix. Thank you for listening. If you want more Moderate Fantasy Violence related content to help inform your view of the circumstances around this podcast, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com and listen to our 90 past episodes, which is a ridiculous amount, as well as read accompanying articles and stuff. You can also go to iTunes and leave us a nice review to help other people get involved.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, or find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can find me on Twitter as @NickMB, or you can read more of my work, purchase my comics, please buy my comics, they're good, at nickbryan.com.
I can confirm they are good.
Yes, thank you, Alistair. And I assure you that's with complete critical integrity.
And just squeeze one more review into the episode. There we go.
Okay, we'll stop now. Until, of course, in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be back for another end of a dead franchise. It is Jessica Jones Season 3. The Marvel Netflix universe finally comes to an end. Weirdly, it's been with us the whole time, so there may actually be a weirdly funereal tone to that episode, but we'll have to see how good a mood we feel about it once we've actually watched Jessica Jones Season 3. Anyway, see you in 2 weeks for that. Bye-bye.
Bye. We're about to go full tilt spoilers at this point, I think. If you're here for a flavour, you've probably got the flavour at this point.
Yes. But before we go full tilt spoilers, I really need the loo. Can I run off for a sec?
Yeah, sure.
Right, back. Sorry. Yeah, anyway, I don't know if I'll leave that trip to the toilet in as spoiler space or if I'll cut it out. But anyway, let's push that shit all the way up.